When I gave my entire life savings to my son, I thought I was securing my place in his home, but the night I set the table for all of us and no one showed up, I realized I might have just paid to disappear. I remember how carefully I arranged everything that evening, the way I always had for years, placing 6 plates around the dining table even though I lived alone now, smoothing the white tablecloth with my palms as if it could somehow hold the family together. Lighting candles I had been saving for a special occasion because I believed this was one, because Daniel had said they would come, because Jessica had smiled that tight, polished smile and told me they were excited to spend more time together now that the house was finally theirs. I had even taken the afternoon to cook Daniel's favorite pot roast, the kind that takes hours to get just right, the kind I used to make every Sunday when he was still a boy who ran into my kitchen without knocking, but that night the house stayed quiet. So quiet that I could hear the ticking of the clock above the stove like it was counting down to something I didn't want to admit. I checked my phone once, then twice, then again, telling myself they were probably stuck in traffic, that maybe Emily had a school event, that maybe something small had come up the way small things always do, but the minutes stretched into an hour. And the candles burned lower, and the food grew cold, and still nothing. When my phone finally lit up, I felt a small flicker of relief, the kind that comes from believing you were wrong to worry, but it wasn't a call, just a short message from Daniel that read, "We're busy tonight." Rain check, and for a moment I simply stared at the words, trying to understand how something so simple could feel so final. I didn't respond right away. I just set the phone down beside my plate and picked up my fork, cutting into the roast as if they were about to walk through the door any second, as if this was still a normal dinner, but the silence pressed in around me. Heavy and unfamiliar, and I realized I hadn't heard Daniel's voice in days, not really heard it, not the way a mother recognizes the difference between words spoken out of habit and words spoken with care. After a while, I stood up and walked to the kitchen, turning off the stove, wrapping the food in foil, placing it neatly into the refrigerator like I had done so many times before, but this time it felt different. Like I was preserving something that was already gone. I told myself it didn't matter, that families get busy, that life moves on, but later that night, when I sat down on the couch and absent-mindedly opened Facebook, I saw the photo that made everything shift. Daniel and Jessica sitting at a long table in a restaurant I recognized, the kind of place we used to go only on birthdays, Emily beside them, smiling, glasses raised in a quiet celebration, and the caption read, "Celebrating our new home. We did it on our own." I looked at that sentence longer than I should have, reading it over and over as if it might change, as if I had misunderstood something, but the words stayed the same, simple and clear, and suddenly the room around me felt unfamiliar. Like I was sitting in someone else's life, watching from the outside. I thought about the check I had written just 3 weeks earlier, the one that emptied the account I had spent decades building, every extra shift, every careful decision. Every small sacrifice folded into a number that I handed over without hesitation because I believed I was helping my family build something we would all share, something that would include me, not replace me. Jessica had held my hands that day, her fingers warm and steady, her voice soft when she said, "You're not just helping us, Margaret, you're part of this home," and I had believed her, not because I was naive, but because I wanted to believe that after everything, after all the years of putting them first, there was still a place for me at their table. But as I sat there staring at that photo, at the empty seat where I should have been, I felt something quiet settle in my chest, not anger, not yet, just a slow, steady understanding that something had shifted in a way I couldn't ignore, and, for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if I hadn't been forgotten at all, but carefully, deliberately left behind. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was upset in the way people expect, but because my mind kept returning to small details I had ignored before, the kind of details that only start to matter once something larger has already shifted. Like the way Daniel had stopped calling me Mom and started saying Margaret when Jessica was around, or how our conversations had become shorter, more practical, as if we were discussing errands instead of sharing a life, and I realized as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, that I could not remember the last time he had asked me how I was without immediately following it with something he needed. The next morning felt unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes a house seem larger than it really is, and I moved through my routine slowly, making coffee, opening the curtains, sitting at the small kitchen table where the sunlight used to feel warm but now only highlighted the empty chair across from me, the one Daniel used to sit in when he would stop by unannounced. Back when visits were spontaneous instead of scheduled weeks in advance through Jessica. I told myself I was overthinking everything, that one missed dinner did not mean anything, that families go through phases, but when I picked up my phone and scrolled through my messages, I noticed how one-sided the conversations had become. How I was always the one reaching out first, always the one asking if they were free, always the one adjusting my time to fit into theirs, and even then the answers were often delayed, brief, or postponed. Later that afternoon, I decided to call Daniel, not because I had something important to say, but because I wanted to hear his voice, to remind myself that the distance I was feeling was not real. That it was just a misunderstanding I had built up in my head, but the call went to voicemail, and, before I could leave a message, my phone buzzed with a text from Jessica that read, "He is in a meeting, I will let him know you called." And I stared at that sentence longer than I should have, not because of what it said, but because of how familiar it felt, like a script that had been repeated enough times to replace something more genuine. I typed back a simple, "Thank you," and set the phone down, telling myself again that it did not mean anything, that she was just being helpful, but something about the way she always answered for him made me feel like I was speaking to a gate instead of a person. Like access to my own son required permission I did not realize I needed. That evening, I opened the small drawer where I kept important papers, not because I had a reason, but because I suddenly felt the need to see something that had not changed, something that still belonged entirely to me. And I found the copy of the bank transfer I had made 3 weeks earlier, the number printed clearly at the bottom of the page, $180,000, a lifetime of careful decisions condensed into a single line. And I ran my fingers over the paper as if it could explain something to me, as if it could tell me whether I had done the right thing or simply made it easier for them to move forward without me. I remembered the day I handed over that money, how Daniel had hugged me tightly, how Jessica had thanked me with a kind of enthusiasm that felt genuine at the time, how Emily had smiled and said they could not wait for me to come over once everything was settled, and I realized that in every version of that conversation, my place had always been in the future, something that would happen later, once the house was finished. Once they were settled, once things calmed down, and now that they had reached that point, I found myself standing outside of it, looking in through a window that used to be open. I closed the drawer carefully and sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the faint sounds of traffic outside, the ordinary noises of a life that suddenly felt disconnected from the one I thought I was building with them. And, for the first time, I allowed myself to consider that this was not temporary, that this was not a phase that would pass on its own, but something more deliberate, something that had been forming slowly while I was focused on helping them move forward. And the thought did not make me angry, not yet. It just made me still, as if moving too quickly might confirm something I was not ready to say out loud. I started noticing it in the smallest ways, the kind of changes that are easy to dismiss at first because they do not come all at once. They arrive quietly, one after another, until they form something you can no longer ignore. Like the afternoon I decided to drive over to Daniel's house without calling ahead, something I used to do all the time back when I did not feel like I needed permission to see my own family, and as I pulled into the driveway, I felt a brief sense of relief seeing his car there, Jessica's too, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe that everything I had been feeling was just in my head, that I would walk up to the door, knock, and everything would fall back into place the way it used to. I carried a small container of cookies I had baked that morning, still slightly warm, the same recipe Daniel loved as a child, and I walked up to the front door, noticing the new paint, the carefully arranged plants, all the signs that the house had truly become theirs. And I hesitated just for a second before reaching into my purse for the spare key I had always kept with me, the one Daniel insisted I have years ago, in case you ever want to stop by, he had said back then, and I remember smiling at the memory as I slid the key into the lock, but it did not turn. I tried again, slower this time, thinking maybe I had the wrong key, but the resistance was clear, final, and I stood there on the porch longer than I should have, holding a key that no longer fit into a door I thought would always be open to me. I could hear faint voices inside, laughter, the sound of movement, and for a moment I considered knocking, but something held me back, something I could not quite explain, as if that simple act might confirm a truth I was not ready to face. So instead, I stepped back quietly, the container of cookies suddenly feeling heavier in my hands, and I walked back to my car without making a sound. I sat there for a few minutes, staring at the front door, telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation, that maybe they had changed the locks for security, that maybe they had forgotten to give me the new key, but even as I tried to justify it, I could not ignore the feeling settling in my chest, the same quiet understanding that had been growing since that empty dinner table, that this was not an oversight, this was a decision. On the drive home, my phone buzzed, and when I glanced at the screen, I saw a message from Jessica that read, "We changed the locks last week for safety reasons, just letting you know," and I could not help but notice that she had not asked if I needed a new key, had not suggested a time to give me one, had simply informed me of a change that redefined my place without saying it directly. I typed back a short reply, "That makes sense," because I did not know what else to say, because pointing it out would not change it, and as I set the phone down, I realized how easily my role had shifted from being someone who belonged there to someone who needed to be informed from the outside. That evening, I placed the untouched container of cookies on my kitchen counter, and for a moment I considered throwing them away, but instead I left them there, the sweetness of them somehow out of place in a room that felt colder than usual. And I sat down at the table, looking at the empty chair across from me, remembering all the times Daniel had sat there, talking about his day, asking for advice, sharing things that mattered, and I tried to trace back the moment when that connection had started to fade, but it was not a single moment. It was a series of small decisions, small shifts, small silences that had added up to something much larger, something that now stood between us like a door I no longer had the key to. There was a time when everything between us felt simple, not easy, but honest, the kind of honesty that comes from years of shared routines and quiet understanding, and I found myself returning to those memories more often now. Not because I wanted to live in the past, but because I needed to remind myself that what I had believed in was real, that I had not imagined the closeness we once had, and I could still see Daniel at 12 years old, sitting at this very table with his homework spread out in front of him, asking me questions he already knew the answers to just so he could keep talking a little longer, and I could hear the way he used to call out for me from down the hallway, his voice certain that I would always be there, that I would always respond. Back then, I did not think about sacrifice as something measurable. It was simply part of being a parent, working extra hours when money was tight, setting aside small amounts into savings accounts that grew slowly over time, choosing practical things over indulgent ones because there was always something more important to prepare for, something in his future that mattered more than anything in mine. And when he got older and started talking about building a life of his own, I felt proud, not worried, because I believed that everything I had done had given him a foundation strong enough to stand on. When Jessica came into his life, I welcomed her the way I had always hoped someone would welcome me, with patience, with openness, with the quiet understanding that family expands, it does not replace, and I remember the first time she came over for dinner. How carefully I prepared everything, how I watched her expressions as she looked around the house, trying to understand what kind of place this was, what kind of person I was, and when she smiled and complimented the meal, I took it as a sign that things would be good, that we would find our rhythm together. Over time, I started noticing small differences, subtle shifts that did not seem important on their own, the way she would answer questions directed at Daniel, the way plans would change without much explanation, the way conversations began to revolve around what they needed rather than what we shared. But I told myself this was normal, that every new relationship brings adjustments, that I just needed to give them space to grow into their own life. So when Daniel first mentioned the house, when he talked about how difficult it was to afford something in a good neighborhood, how they were trying to plan for the future, I did not hesitate, Not because I felt obligated, but because it felt like a natural continuation of everything I had already been doing. Supporting him, helping him build something stable, something lasting, and when I sat across from them at this same table just a few weeks ago, writing that check, I remember how steady my hand felt, how certain I was in that moment, how Jessica reached across and held my hands, her voice soft and reassuring as she said, "You are part of this home," and Daniel nodded, his expression grateful in a way that felt familiar, and I believed them, not because I needed reassurance, but because it aligned with everything I thought we were, a family that supported each other, a family that stayed connected no matter how life changed. But now, as I sat alone in that same kitchen, the memory felt different, not false, but incomplete, like a conversation where I had only heard half of what was being said, and I began to see how easily something meaningful can be reframed over time, how a promise can shift without ever being directly broken, how you can give everything you have believing you are strengthening a bond, only to realize later that you were the only one holding onto it. A few days passed in a quiet routine that felt heavier than it used to, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the absence of things I once considered normal had begun to take shape. And I found myself paying closer attention to what was no longer there, the missed calls that never came, the invitations that were never extended, the small check-ins that used to happen without effort, and it was during one of those quiet mornings, while I was folding laundry at the kitchen table, that my phone buzzed with a message from Emily, a message that seemed ordinary at first, but carried a tone I could not ignore. She asked if I was home, and when I said yes, she replied that she might stop by later if that was okay, and I felt a small flicker of something I had not felt in days, something close to relief, because at least someone still thought of me. Without needing a reason. When she arrived that afternoon, she stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, her backpack still on her shoulder, her expression uncertain in a way that did not match the easy familiarity we usually shared, and I stepped aside to let her in, noticing how her eyes moved around the room as if she was trying to find the right words before she spoke them. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where so many conversations had once felt effortless, and for a while we talked about simple things, her school, her friends, the usual details that fill the space between people who are comfortable with each other. But there was a hesitation in her voice, a pause between sentences that suggested she was holding something back, and I did not rush her, I simply listened, the way I always had, waiting for her to decide when she was ready. Eventually, she set her glass down and looked at me directly, her expression shifting from casual to careful, and she said something that seemed small on the surface, but carried a weight that settled deeply in my chest. She told me that her mother had been talking to people about the house, about how they had managed everything on their own, how they had taken on the responsibility without help, and then, almost as an afterthought, she added that they sometimes mentioned me. But not in the way I expected, not as someone who had contributed, but as someone who had needed their support, someone who had nowhere else to go, someone they had helped out of kindness. I did not respond immediately, not because I did not understand what she was saying, but because I needed a moment to let the meaning settle into something I could hold without reacting, and I could see from the way Emily watched me that she was worried, that she had not known how I would take it, that she was trying to be careful in a situation she did not fully understand. I asked her, gently, if that was what they truly believed or just what they said to others, and she hesitated, her eyes dropping to the table for a brief moment before she answered, and in that pause, I realized that sometimes the difference between belief and presentation does not matter as much as we think, because what people choose to say repeatedly has a way of becoming their truth, regardless of how it started. When she left later that afternoon, I walked her to the door and watched as she made her way down the driveway, her steps slower than usual, as if she was carrying something she could not quite put down, and I stood there for a while after she was gone, looking out at the empty street, feeling the quiet settle around me again, but this time it was different, not uncertain, not questioning, but clearer in a way that made it harder to ignore. I went back inside and sat at the table, placing my hands flat against the surface, The same surface where I had once believed everything was shared, everything was understood. And I thought about how easily a story can be rewritten when the people who know the truth choose not to tell it, how quickly a role can be reassigned without any formal acknowledgement, and for the first time, I stopped asking myself whether I was overthinking things and began to accept that what I was seeing, what I was feeling, was not a misunderstanding but a pattern, one that had been building quietly while I was focused on holding everything together, and now that I could see it clearly, I knew that pretending otherwise would only make it easier for it to continue. I did not confront them, not because I did not have the right words, but because I had begun to understand that saying those words too early would only give them a chance to reshape the situation before I fully saw it for what it was. So instead I chose something different, something quieter. I chose to step back. It started with small changes, the kind that no one notices at first. I stopped calling Daniel in the evenings the way I used to, stopped sending messages asking if they needed anything from the grocery store, stopped offering to help in ways that had once felt natural, and I told myself I was simply giving them space. The same explanation I had used so many times before, but this time it was not about giving, it was about observing. The first few days passed without any reaction, no messages asking if everything was all right, no calls checking in, just the same silence that had been there before, and I realized how easy it was for my absence to go unnoticed, how quickly a pattern can disappear when only one person has been maintaining it. By the end of the week, I received a short message from Daniel, not asking how I was, but asking if I had any extra cash available because they were running into some unexpected costs with the house, and I read it carefully. Noticing how the request was framed, casual, almost routine, as if it were a continuation of something that had never been questioned, and I took a moment before responding, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity. I typed back that I would need to check my finances first, something I had never said before, something that created just enough distance to change the tone, and when he replied with a simple, "Okay, let me know," I could almost feel the shift, subtle but real. Like a conversation that had lost its assumed direction. Later that afternoon, Jessica sent a message of her own, longer, more polished, explaining how the renovation costs were higher than expected, how they were trying to make the house perfect for the future, how it would benefit everyone in the long run. And I read her words slowly, recognizing the same careful language she had used before, the same gentle framing that turned requests into shared goals, and for the first time, I did not respond right away. I set the phone down and let the message sit there, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to see what would happen if I did nothing. Hours passed, then the evening, and eventually another message appeared, shorter this time, asking if I had seen the previous one, and I replied simply that I had, but that I needed time to think about it, and I could almost imagine the pause on the other side. The moment where expectation met resistance. That night, I sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where so many decisions had been made without question, and I realized that this was the first time I was choosing not to follow the pattern they had come to rely on. The first time I was allowing silence to speak for me instead of filling it with reassurance or support. It did not feel dramatic, it did not feel like a confrontation, it felt quiet, controlled, almost calm, and in that calm, I began to understand something important, that stepping back was not the same as losing something. It was the first step in seeing it clearly, and as I looked around the room, at the familiar objects that had not changed, I felt a shift inside me that was just as subtle as everything else that had happened, but far more significant. Because for the first time, I was no longer reacting to what they were doing, I was watching it unfold, and that difference changed everything. The change became clearer not through what they said, but through how they began to react to what I no longer offered, and it did not take long for the tone to shift in a way that felt both subtle and unmistakable, like a conversation that had quietly lost its balance. 2 days after my last message, Daniel called me, something he had not done in weeks, and for a brief moment, hearing his voice again brought back a familiar warmth, but it faded quickly when I realized the purpose behind it, the careful way he spoke, as if he was navigating something delicate rather than simply talking to his mother. He asked how I was, But the question felt like an introduction rather than a genuine concern, and before I could answer fully, he began explaining the situation with the house again, the unexpected costs, the pressure they were under, the plans they had already made, and I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to hear exactly how the story had evolved in his mind. There was a confidence in his voice that had not been there before, a kind of assumption that the outcome was already decided, that my role was simply to support what they had already set in motion, and when he paused, waiting for my response, I realized that this was the moment where the pattern would either continue or change. I told him, calmly, that I was not in a position to contribute anything further at this time, and I let the words settle without explanation, without apology, and the silence that followed was different from any we had shared. Before, it was not empty, it was filled with something unspoken, something that neither of us seemed ready to name. He responded quickly, almost too quickly, saying that he understood, that it was just a question, that they would figure something out, but there was a slight edge beneath his words, a tension that had not been there when asking had always been met with agreement. Later that evening, Jessica sent another message, shorter than before, less polished, asking if everything was all right and whether something had changed, and I read it carefully, recognizing the shift not just in tone but in expectation, as if my response had introduced a variable they had not planned for. I replied that everything was fine, that I simply needed to be more mindful of my own situation moving forward, and I kept the message brief, measured, leaving no space for interpretation beyond what I had said. Over the next few days, I noticed something else begin to surface, small inconsistencies in the way they spoke about their plans, slight contradictions between what Daniel said and what Jessica implied, details that did not quite align. And while none of it was enough to form a complete picture, it was enough to suggest that there was more happening beneath the surface than I had originally understood. I did not question them directly, I did not push for answers, I simply paid attention, the way one does when something important is beginning to reveal itself slowly, piece by piece. One evening, as I sat in my living room with the television on but not really watching it, my phone buzzed again, and this time it was a group message, something I had not seen in a while, with Daniel sharing an update about the house, photos of the progress. The new kitchen, the freshly painted walls, the furniture being arranged, and I looked at each image carefully, noticing not just what was there, but what was not. There was no mention of me, no acknowledgement of how any of it had been made possible, just a narrative that seemed to stand on its own, complete and self-contained. I did not respond to the message. I simply set the phone down and sat there for a moment, letting the realization settle into something steady and clear, and in that moment, I understood something that had not been obvious before, that I was not just being overlooked, I was being rewritten out of the story entirely, and once I saw it that way, everything else began to make sense in a way that left no room for doubt. The more I paid attention, the more I realized that what I had thought was distance was actually structure, something intentional, something built carefully over time, and once I saw it that way, I knew that guessing would not be enough. I needed to understand exactly what had been done and how. The next morning, I took out the folder where I kept my financial records, the same one I had opened days earlier, but this time I approached it differently, not with uncertainty, but with purpose, and I spread the documents out across the table. Each paper representing a decision I had made without hesitation, each number tied to years of quiet discipline. I found the bank transfer again, the confirmation with the exact amount, $180,000, and I looked more closely at the details I had overlooked before, the reference line, the account structure, the way the transfer had been categorized. And something about it made me pause, not because it was wrong, but because it was more specific than I remembered. Later that afternoon, I decided to go to the bank, something I had not planned but suddenly felt necessary, and as I sat across from the representative, explaining that I wanted to review a recent transfer, I kept my tone calm, measured. The way I had learned to be in situations where clarity mattered more than emotion. She pulled up the record, confirming the amount, the date, the destination, And then she explained something that shifted my understanding in a way I had not expected, that the transfer had not been processed as a simple gift, but as a structured transaction. One that included documentation and conditions that could still be accessed if needed. I listened carefully, asking a few questions, not too many, just enough to understand the framework, and when she mentioned that I had the right to request full documentation and consult with a legal advisor regarding the terms, I felt something settle into place. Not relief, not yet, but certainty. On the way home, I thought about every conversation I had had with Daniel and Jessica about the house, about how everything had been framed as support, as family helping family, and I realized that while they may have chosen to see it that way, the structure itself told a different story, one that had not disappeared simply because it had not been mentioned again. That evening, I placed the documents back into the folder, but this time I organized them differently, separating what I had assumed from what was actually recorded, and the distinction between those two things felt more important than anything else. I did not call them, I did not bring it up, I simply continued as I had been, quiet, observant, allowing them to move forward under the belief that nothing had changed, that the pattern was still intact. And I watched as they continued to act within that assumption, sending occasional updates, making plans that did not include me, speaking in a way that suggested the past had already been settled. But now, as I sat at the table, looking at the papers in front of me, I understood that the past had not disappeared, it had simply been left unspoken, and the difference between those two things was something they had not considered. I closed the folder slowly, placing it beside me, and for the first time since all of this began, I felt something shift inside me that was not rooted in confusion or doubt, but in awareness, the kind that does not demand immediate action, but changes the way every action will be taken from that point forward. And as I looked around the quiet room, I realized that I was no longer trying to understand what had happened to me, I was beginning to understand what I could do about it. By the time the following week arrived, I no longer felt the urge to fill the silence between us. Instead, I let it stretch naturally, watching how they responded when I stopped maintaining the connection they had quietly come to rely on. And what I saw confirmed what I had already begun to understand. Their messages became less frequent, more transactional, appearing only when there was something to share or something to gain, and I noticed how carefully those messages were worded, always positive, always forward-looking, never reflective, as if the past had already been settled in their minds and no longer needed to be acknowledged. One evening, Daniel called again, his tone lighter this time, almost casual, as if nothing had changed, and he spoke about the house, about how everything was coming together, how the kitchen looked better than they expected, how they were planning a small gathering soon to celebrate, and I listened quietly, not interrupting, not correcting, simply allowing him to present the version of reality he had chosen. He did not invite me, not directly, not even indirectly, and that absence said more than anything else he could have added, and when he finished speaking, there was a pause, a brief moment where it seemed like he might say something more, something personal. But instead he shifted the conversation, asking how I had been, the question arriving late, almost as an afterthought. I answered simply, telling him I was doing well, that I had been keeping busy, and I kept my tone steady, neutral, offering no openings, no invitations for further discussion, and after a few more exchanges, the call ended without resolution. Without connection, just another conversation that existed on the surface, without touching anything beneath it. The next day, Jessica sent a message about the upcoming gathering, not an invitation, but an update. A photo of the dining room set for guests, the table arranged beautifully, chairs evenly spaced, decorations carefully chosen. And I looked at the image for a long moment, noticing how familiar it felt, how it mirrored the way I used to prepare for family dinners, and I wondered briefly if she had learned that from me or simply recreated it in her own way. But what stood out most was not what was present in the photo, it was what was missing. There was no place for me, no acknowledgement that I had ever been part of that setting, and the realization settled quietly, without shock, without anger, just clarity. That evening, I opened the folder again. The documents now arranged in a way that made their meaning unmistakable, and I reviewed them slowly, line by line, confirming what I already knew, that the transaction I had made was not as simple as they had chosen to present it, that there were structures in place, conditions that still existed, rights that had not disappeared simply because they had not been discussed. I did not rush, I did not act immediately. Instead, I took a piece of paper and began writing down what I needed to do next, not in a hurried way, but carefully, methodically, outlining the steps as they became clear in my mind. Reviewing the documentation, consulting with someone who understood the legal framework, ensuring that every decision I made from this point forward was grounded in something solid rather than assumption. As I wrote, I felt a sense of calm that had not been there before, not because the situation had improved, but because I was no longer reacting to it, I was preparing for it, and that difference changed the way everything felt. I set the paper down beside the folder and leaned back in my chair, looking around the room that had once felt too quiet, too empty, and realizing that the silence no longer carried the same weight. It was no longer something I needed to escape. It had become something I could use, a space where I could think clearly, where I could see things as they were without distraction, and in that clarity, I understood that what came next would not be about confronting them in anger or trying to reclaim what had already been reshaped. It would be about something much more precise, something they had not anticipated, and as I sat there in that quiet room, I knew that the next time we faced each other, it would not be as someone asking to be included. It would be as someone who understood exactly where she stood and exactly what she was capable of doing. I did not wait for an invitation, and I did not announce that I was coming, because I had learned by then that waiting had only made it easier for them to define the terms, and this time, I intended to arrive on my own. The evening of their gathering was quiet on my street, the kind of quiet that settles in just before dusk, and I took my time getting ready, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, choosing a simple dress, brushing my hair the way I always had, moving through each step with a calm that felt unfamiliar only because I had not allowed myself to feel it before. When I arrived at the house, the lights were already on, warm and inviting from the outside, and I could hear voices through the door, laughter, the soft clink of glasses, the sound of people who believed everything was exactly as it should be. And for a moment I stood there, not uncertain, but aware of the difference between what they believed and what I now understood. I knocked once, lightly, and waited, and when the door opened, it was Jessica who stood there, her expression shifting almost immediately from polite surprise to something less defined, something that tried to place me within a context she had not prepared for. "Margaret," she said, her voice controlled, as if searching for the right tone, and I simply smiled, stepping inside without waiting to be invited, not out of defiance, but because I no longer saw the need to ask for permission to enter a place that had once been part of my life. The room quieted slightly as I walked in, not completely, but enough for the change to be felt, conversations softening, glances shifting, and I could see Daniel across the room, his posture stiffening just enough to reveal that my presence had disrupted something he had assumed would go uninterrupted. "I did not realize you were having guests," I said, my voice even, not accusatory, just factual, and he responded quickly, explaining that it was a small gathering, something informal, something that had come together quickly. And I listened without interrupting, allowing the explanation to exist without challenging it. I moved through the room slowly, taking in the details, the table set carefully, the decorations arranged with intention, the space filled with the kind of warmth that comes from presentation rather than connection. And I recognized elements of my own habits in the way everything had been prepared, details that had once belonged to me now existing without acknowledgement. After a few moments, I placed my purse on a nearby chair and turned to face them, both of them, Daniel and Jessica, who now stood closer together, their expressions composed but alert, and I spoke calmly, without raising my voice, without changing my tone, because I had learned that clarity does not require volume. "I have been reviewing the transfer I made," I said, choosing my words carefully, not to provoke, but to state, and I saw the shift in their expressions, subtle but immediate, the kind of reaction that comes not from surprise, but from recognition. Jessica spoke first, her voice measured, explaining that everything had already been handled, that the money had been used for the house, that there was nothing more to discuss, and I let her finish, not because I agreed, but because I wanted her to say it fully. To place her understanding clearly into the space between us. When she was done, I nodded slightly, acknowledging her words without accepting them, and I continued, I understand how it has been used, but that does not change what it is, and I paused there, not for effect, but because I wanted the distinction to be clear, not just to them, but to myself. Daniel stepped forward then, his voice tighter, asking what I meant, and I met his gaze steadily, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more direct, and I said, it was not a gift, and I let the words settle, simple, unembellished, carrying only the weight of what they were. The room grew quieter, not completely silent, but enough for the shift to be undeniable, and in that moment, I realized that this was the first time we were standing on equal ground, not because the situation had changed, but because I had. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and in that silence I could see something shift behind their expressions, not confusion, not entirely, but calculation, the kind that happens when a situation no longer fits the version of it you have been relying on. And Jessica was the first to recover, her posture straightening slightly as she stepped forward, her voice calm but firmer now, explaining that we had all agreed on helping each other, that the money had been given willingly, that there had never been any discussion of conditions, and I listened without interrupting, allowing her to place each word carefully into the space between us, because I understood now that what mattered was not how confidently something was said, but whether it could stand when examined. When she finished, I reached into my purse and took out a single envelope, nothing dramatic, nothing large, just a simple document folded neatly, and I placed it on the table beside me without rushing, without drawing unnecessary attention. And I said quietly, that is why I asked someone to review the transfer, not as a challenge, but as a continuation of the conversation they had not expected to have. Daniel looked at the envelope, then back at me, his expression tightening in a way that reminded me of when he was younger and realized something had not gone the way he thought it would, and he asked what that meant, his voice no longer casual, no longer certain, and I met his gaze the same way I had before, steady, without hesitation, because by then I understood that this moment was not about convincing them, it was about stating what was already true. It means the transfer was structured, I said, choosing each word carefully, and it includes terms that have not been addressed, and I could see the way that sentence settled differently than anything I had said before, not because it was louder or sharper, but because it was specific, grounded in something beyond assumption. Jessica responded quickly, her tone shifting again, this time more controlled, more deliberate, suggesting that there must be a misunderstanding, that everything had been handled properly, that there was no reason to involve anyone else, and I let her finish. Just as I had before, because I had learned that interruption only creates noise, and I no longer needed noise. When she stopped, I opened the envelope and took out the document, placing it flat on the table, not pushing it toward them, not insisting that they read it, just letting it exist there, visible, undeniable, and I said, I am not here to argue about what we thought it was, I am here to be clear about what it is, and I allowed the distinction to settle without explanation. The room had grown quieter again, conversations around us fading into the background, not because I had demanded attention, but because something in the tone of the moment had shifted enough to draw it naturally, and I could feel the weight of that shift. Not heavy, not overwhelming, just present, steady, like something that had finally found its place. Daniel picked up the document slowly, his eyes scanning the first few lines, and I watched as his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that what he was reading did not align with what he had expected, and he looked up at me again, this time with a different kind of question, not defensive, not dismissive, but uncertain in a way that had not been there before. I did not fill the silence that followed. I did not explain further, because I understood now that clarity does not require repetition, it requires space, and in that space, I allowed them to see the situation without my interpretation shaping it. After a moment, I spoke again, not louder, not more forcefully, just clearly, I have already spoken to someone about next steps, and I paused there, not to create tension, but to let the meaning of those words exist without dilution. And I will be moving forward accordingly. And that was all I said, because there was nothing more to add, nothing more to explain. Everything that needed to be understood was already present, not just in the document, but in the shift that had taken place between us. And as I stood there, I realized that for the first time since all of this began, I was no longer trying to be included in their version of the story. I was defining my own. After I left the house that evening, I did not look back, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because there was nothing left behind that still belonged to me in the way it once had. And as I walked to my car, the air felt different, not lighter. Not heavier, just clearer, like something that had been unresolved for too long had finally taken its proper shape. The following days moved forward without urgency, but with direction, and I followed through on each step I had outlined, meeting with a legal advisor who reviewed the documentation in detail, confirming what I had already begun to understand, that the structure of the transfer carried weight, that it was not erased by assumption or silence, that it existed regardless of how it had been presented afterward. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, just a series of formal communications, precise and measured, outlining what needed to be addressed and what would follow if it was not, and I allowed that process to unfold without interference, without emotion, because by then I understood that clarity is most effective when it is not clouded by reaction. Daniel reached out more than once during that time, his messages longer, more careful, asking to talk, suggesting we could resolve things privately, that there was no need to make it complicated, and I read each message fully before responding, choosing my words with the same care I had applied to everything else, telling him that I was open to discussion, but that it would need to take place within the framework that now existed, not outside of it, not in the vague space where things could be reinterpreted. Jessica did not message as often, but when she did, her tone had changed, no longer polished, no longer certain, asking questions that were less about explanation and more about outcome, and I answered them simply, without elaboration, because there was no longer anything to negotiate in the way they had once expected. Weeks passed, and the situation resolved itself in a way that was neither sudden nor surprising, but steady, consistent with the structure that had been there from the beginning, and when it was done, I did not feel victorious. I did not feel vindicated. I felt settled, as if something that had been unsettled for too long had finally returned to its proper place. I moved into a smaller condominium a few miles away, a space that required less maintenance, less effort, but offered something I had not fully recognized I had been missing: control, not over others, but over my own environment, my own time, my own decisions, and I arranged it carefully, placing each item where it belonged, not out of habit, but out of intention. Emily visited a few times, her presence unchanged, her conversations still easy, still honest, and I could see in her the same awareness that had brought her to my door that afternoon, a quiet understanding that did not need to be explained. And I welcomed that without asking her to take sides, because I had learned that clarity does not require agreement, it only requires truth. Occasionally, I would pass by the house, not deliberately, just in the course of moving through the area, and I would see the lights on, the same warm glow from the windows, the same carefully arranged exterior, and I would recognize it for what it was. Not a place I had lost, but a place that had changed in a way that no longer included me, and that understanding did not bring sadness. It brought something else, something quieter, something more stable. I no longer wondered how things had shifted. I no longer questioned what I could have done differently, because I understood now that the most important shift had not been theirs, it had been mine. The moment I stopped trying to remain part of something that had already moved on and started defining what remained within my control. And as I sat in my new living room one evening, the sunlight coming through the windows in a way that felt both familiar and new, I realized that I had not been forgotten in the way I once believed. I had been replaced in a story that no longer needed me. And in recognizing that, I had done something they had not expected. I had replaced that story with one of my own, one that did not depend on being included, one that did not require permission, one that existed entirely on my terms.